The first time I understood what had been happening in those woods, I was standing at a fresh mound of dark earth in the snow, with my dead dog's body wrapped in burlap beside me, and I had not dug that hole. I want you to understand that before anything else, before my name, before the mountain, before any of the years that led to that moment, I had walked out to the tree line with a spade in my hands and a lantern swinging from my wrist, prepared to dig through frozen ground in the dark. Because that is what you do when something you loved has died and the ground is hard and you are 63 years old and alone, and there is nobody left to help you. I had walked out expecting to work until my back gave out, expecting to chip through 6 inches of frost-locked earth with my bad left hand and my aging shoulders, expecting the particular misery of that kind of labor in that kind of cold, because grief comes with its own physical requirements, and I had learned a long time ago not to argue with them. What I found instead was a hole already 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide, the displaced earth piled neatly to one side like someone had been careful about it, deliberately careful, the way you pile earth when you intend to put it back. I stood at the edge of that hole with the spade in my hand and the lantern throwing its yellow circle across the snow, and I looked at the tracks around the perimeter pressed deep into the white. Not boot prints, not paw prints from any animal I had ever catalogued in 22 years on that mountain. Something with feet shaped almost like a man's, but twice the size, the toes longer and splayed wide at the front, the heel sunk 2 inches deeper than my own when I stepped beside one to compare. Something enormous had come to my land in the night, in the quiet hours while I sat inside with my hand on a dying dog, and it had dug a grave for him before I even knew he was gone. I stood at that hole in the dark and the cold and understood that this had never been a secret I was keeping. It had been a secret being kept around me for 3 full years, and now it was revealing itself to me in the only language it knew, the language of earth and effort and care expressed through physical work. I need to go back to the beginning. I need to take you through all of it, because if I start here, at the grave in the snow at 3 in the morning, you will think this is only a horror story. It is not. Or it is not only that. At its center, underneath all the impossible things I am going to tell you, this is the strangest and most complete love story I have ever been privileged to witness, and I watched nearly all of it from 15 feet away, evening after evening, for 1,012 days. My name is Robert Bowman, and I came to the Cascades in my 58th year after spending the previous 4 years dismantling the life I had built and finding the rubble less distressing than I expected. 22 years in the United States Army, infantry, and then intelligence work ended when a mortar round went off close enough to take the 3 middle fingers of my left hand and most of the useful hearing in my right ear. The injury was not dramatic by the standards of the men I served with, and I do not offer it as a credential for anything, except to explain why I left the Army at 44 with a partial disability pension, a specific and permanent quietness on one side of my head, and a set of skills that are not easily converted into civilian employment without a significant tolerance for moral ambiguity. I did contracting work for 8 years. The kind of work that pays well and asks you not to look too directly at what you are facilitating. And during those 8 years, I also maintained a marriage to a woman named Margaret who was good and patient and deserved more clarity than I was capable of providing. She left on a Thursday in November, a cold and overcast Thursday with the feeling of coming snow in the air, and she took 1 suitcase and left me the house in Boise, and a note on the kitchen table that said she hoped I found whatever I was looking for because she had stopped believing I was looking for it with her. I read that note 3 times and could not find anything in it to argue with. I sold the house in Boise 6 months later and moved to the 40 acres in the Cascades that my uncle had left me, a man who had understood solitude as a preference rather than a failure. and I began the process of becoming someone who lived quietly on a mountain and asked very little of the world and expected the world to return the favor. The cabin needed work when I arrived. The roof over the south addition was compromised, and the windows had not been resealed in years, and the barn was in worse shape than the cabin. And I spent that first autumn doing the work with the focused attention of a man who needs to be tired enough to sleep and busy enough not to think. By the first hard frost, I had the cabin weatherproofed, and a cord and a half of wood split and stacked, and a routine that involved waking before light and working until dark and cooking simple meals and reading by lantern light until sleep came. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles by road. The nearest town of any consequence was 12 miles. I had a truck and a rifle and a hand radio and a satellite phone for emergencies, and everything else I needed came up the mountain with me in the truck bed. Or I did without. I was not unhappy in that life. I want to be clear about that because I know how it sounds, and I know the assumptions people make. Sometimes a man is just done with noise. Sometimes the quiet of a mountain morning with the frost on the meadow grass and the creek running cold and no human voice in any direction is not a symptom of anything. Sometimes it is just what a person needs, and the person is smart enough to know it. Hector came into my life 6 months after I moved up there, in the early part of March, when the snow was still deep on the north-facing slopes, but the south meadow was beginning to show bare ground in the afternoon. He was a 7-year-old blue-tick coonhound that a man named Pendleton, who ran a small farm at the base of the mountain road, was giving away because he was, in Pendleton's direct assessment, past his hunting prime and too slow and too expensive to justify another winter's feed. I drove the 12 miles to Pendleton's place on a Tuesday morning, with no particular expectation, thinking I would look at the dog and probably decline. Thinking what I needed was companionship of some kind, but not the full commitment of an animal. The dog was sitting on the front porch steps when I pulled in, and he looked at me as I came across the yard with the expression of an animal that has already done the calculation and does not expect the outcome to favor him. He was about 55 pounds, deep-chested, with a graying muzzle and ears that hung past his jaw, and one of them had an old tear that had healed crooked, giving him an asymmetry that might have looked ridiculous on a younger dog, but on him looked like a scar that had been earned honestly. I sat down on the step beside him, and he turned and put his nose against my wrist and sniffed for a long time, and then sat back and looked forward again, at the yard, like he had confirmed something and filed it away. I loaded him into the truck, and he sat in the passenger seat with his nose out the window for the full 12 miles back up the mountain, reading the air with the practiced attention of a dog who has been doing that for his entire working life. When we reached the cabin, he stepped down from the truck and walked once around the perimeter of the building in a slow, methodical survey, and then went up the porch steps and stood at the door and looked back at me over his shoulder. I opened the door, and he went inside and found the corner nearest the stove and lay down. That was our entire negotiation. That was the whole of it. In 10 years, I never once doubted that it had been the right arrangement for both of us. Hector was not a young dog when he came to me, and he had the personality to match. He was deliberate in everything. Unhurried, capable of sitting still for hours with his chin on the porch railing and his eyes moving slowly across the meadow and the tree line beyond it, cataloging what he saw with the patience of something that understood the difference between watching and waiting. He had the dignity of an animal who had worked hard for most of his life and had arrived at an age where the work was behind him, and the days stretched out, full and unclaimed, and there was nothing in them that required urgency. We agreed on most things. We agreed on the value of early mornings, and the right hour for a fire in the evening, and the correct depth of silence that a good day required. I gave him the corner near the stove and twice daily meals, and the freedom to go where he wanted on the property, and the unspoken reassurance that I would be there when he came back. And he gave me a reason to maintain a schedule, and something warm and breathing in the corner of the room on the long mountain nights. And that was our agreement, and neither of us required it to be more than that. He slept 12 hours a day, and ate with deliberate enthusiasm twice, and spent his waking hours largely on the porch, chin on the railing, watching. In those first months I thought nothing of his watching. He was a hunting dog. The woods and the meadow were his natural subject matter. The watching was what he was built for. The first summer passed without incident, or rather, it passed in the way that first summers do when you are settling into a new life, full of practical problems and physical work, and the particular satisfaction of a day that ends with visible progress. I reframed 2 walls in the barn, and poured a new concrete apron at the door, and repaired the fence line along the north property boundary. I learned the specific personality of my 40 acres, where the ground stayed wet long after rain, where the deer trails crossed and what hours they used them, where the creek deepened enough to hold trout and what the trout were eating in each month. Hector came with me on most of these expeditions, moving at his own pace, consulting various interesting patches of ground, and then catching up with an unhurried trot, and I got used to the rhythm of a day that included another creature's perspective on it. I noticed, that summer, that his evening sessions on the porch were attentive in a specific way, that sometimes his tail would move in a slow and low arc that was different from his alert posture, that he would sometimes make a soft sound in a register I had not heard from him before, not a hunting sound, and not a distress sound, but something more like acknowledgement. I noticed these things the way you notice small weather changes, registering them without investing in them, and I let them pass. It was the September of that first year, 14 months after I had moved to the mountain, that I first saw the thing at the tree line. The light in September on that mountain goes golden and horizontal in the late afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything it touches look slightly more significant than it is, and I was sitting in my porch chair with a cup of coffee cooling in my hand when I saw the shape at the edge of the trees. The tree line was 60 yards from the porch. In the September light, at that distance, the shadows between the trunks were already deep, and the edge of the forest was a ragged boundary between illuminated meadow grass and dark interior. What I saw standing at that boundary was large. Not large in the way a bear is large when it comes to the tree line to look at a cabin, standing up for a moment out of curiosity before dropping back to 4 legs and moving on. This shape was large in the way a standing figure is large when the figure is much bigger than any standing figure has a right to be. It was upright, it was still. It was at the tree line, with both feet planted and both hands, because they were hands, loose at its sides, and it was looking at Hector, and Hector was looking back at it. Hector's tail was moving in that slow, low arc. Hector's chin was off the railing, and his head was up, and his ears were forward but not in alarm, forward in the specific posture of engaged attention, the way a dog looks at something it already knows. I sat very still and did not reach for my rifle, which was leaning against the cabin wall not 4 feet from my chair. I did not reach for it because Hector was not afraid, and Hector had better senses than I did, and in 22 years of military service I had learned with considerable force that the animal on the ground is almost always right about the immediate situation. If Hector was not afraid of what was standing at my tree line, then I would wait and watch and understand before I acted. The shape stood there for perhaps 20 minutes in the last of the September light, and then stepped back between the trunks and disappeared. Hector exhaled slowly, the long breath of a dog settling back into rest, and put his chin back on the railing and closed his eyes. I sat in my chair until full dark, turning what I had seen over in my mind the way you turn a stone to see what is underneath it, and I did not arrive at any conclusion that I found satisfactory. I will tell you now what I came to understand I had been seeing, though the understanding arrived gradually over many months and was never complete. What stood at my tree line that September evening, and nearly every evening for the next 3 years, was a dogman. I say that word plainly because I have no better word, and because at 63 years old I am not interested in euphemism, and I have nothing left to protect. No reputation in any community that would be injured by this account, no professional standing that could be compromised. I am a man who spent 3 years watching something that should not exist come to the edge of his meadow every evening, and I wrote it all down in 3 composition notebooks, and I am telling you what is in those notebooks as accurately as I can. The creature was approximately 8 feet tall when it stood straight, which it did not always do. It moved on 2 legs with a gait that was not human, a forward-leaning roll with a long stride that covered ground quickly without appearing to hurry. Its head was canine in structure, with a long muzzle and upright ears and dark eyes that had the reflective quality of a dog's eyes when light catches them at the right angle, amber and deep and directional. Its body was covered in dense fur that was brownish-black, darker on the back and lighter on the chest and inner arms, and it went through what appeared to be a seasonal coat cycle the way large animals do, thicker through the winter and thinner in July and August. Its hands had 4 fingers and a thumb, and the fingers were proportioned differently from human fingers, longer in the middle sections and ending in something between a thick nail and a narrow claw. When the wind came from the tree line, it brought a smell that I came to know well over 3 years. Wet earth and iron, and something almost like pine resin, but not quite. An organic smell, an animal smell, but not a bad one. The second creature was similar in basic structure, but shorter by roughly a foot, more slender, with a posture that was less squared and more variable, a hesitance in the shoulders that I came to associate with youth or with a naturally more cautious disposition. I named the larger one Goliath, because he was the most physically imposing thing I had ever seen outside of an armored vehicle, and the name arrived without deliberation and stayed. The smaller one I named Wren, after my younger sister who had died of a brain aneurysm in 1991 at the age of 31, who had been in life exactly the combination of small and watchful and quietly fierce that this creature demonstrated from the beginning. Now I need to tell you about the birch bark, because the birch bark is what I think about most when I think about those 3 years. It is the thing that made the difference between watching and participating, the detail that moved me from observer to something else, something harder to name. About 3 weeks after I first saw the shape at the tree line, I came out onto the porch one morning at first light and found a piece of white birch bark on the bottom step. It was approximately the size of my palm, stripped cleanly from its tree, no ragged edges, the inner surface pale and smooth and slightly curved, and it was placed with obvious care in the exact center of the step. Bark side up, not blown there by any wind, and not fallen from the birch cluster near the creek, which was 30 yards in the other direction. I stood on the porch and looked at it for a long time. Then I picked it up and turned it over and held it in my bad left hand, and found nothing remarkable about it except its placement and the fact of its placement. I set it on the porch railing and went about my day. The next morning it was gone. 3 days later there was another piece on the step, a different size and shape, placed the same way. I picked that one up too and held it for a moment and then set it on the railing, and again it was gone by morning. This went on for approximately 6 weeks, pieces of birch bark appearing on the step every 2 or 3 days, always placed, always taken. I began to understand that what was at my tree line was not only visiting Hector, it was also making a form of contact with me. Not in any language I had a word for, not in a way I could translate, but deliberately, with intention, with the patience of something that understood that communication between unlike creatures requires repetition and time. I started leaving something back. One November morning, I went to the birch cluster by the creek and stripped a piece of bark from one of the smaller trees and carried it to the bottom step and placed it there, bark side up, centered, the way it had always been left for me. The next morning, it was gone. 2 nights later, Goliath stood at the tree line for 40 minutes instead of his usual 20, and Wren, who had previously stayed back in the dark behind him, came to stand beside him at the edge of the meadow grass. I sat in my chair on the porch in the November cold and watched both of them watching Hector at the railing, and I felt something that I have not felt many times in my life, something I can only describe imprecisely as the specific opposite of loneliness. Not happiness, not warmth in the ordinary sense. The particular easing of a weight I had been carrying so long I had stopped noticing its mass. That November night, I kept the lantern burning on the porch railing until after 8 o'clock, well past my usual hour, because neither of the shapes at the tree line had moved, and I did not want to be the one to end it. I should pause here for a moment, because I have been told by younger people that I need to do something called acknowledging the format, which apparently has to do with the strange mechanics of how a story like this reaches people now, traveling through machines and screens to find you wherever you are. I am 63 years old, and I still do not entirely understand how this works, and the person helping me put this together has explained it to me 3 times in increasingly simple language, and I understand it about as well as I understand what was at my tree line, which is to say functionally, if not philosophically. I know you are there. I know you found this somehow, through some process involving algorithms and recommendation systems that work on principles as opaque to me as the behavior of the things I watched in my meadow for 3 years. I find that an interesting parallel. Something finds you. You do not always know how. The finding is the part that matters. The winter of the 2nd year was when the routine solidified into something I can only describe as a relationship, though I am aware of how strange that word sounds in this context. Goliath and Wren came every evening without exception, unless a storm was severe enough to make the 60 yards of meadow invisible from the porch, and even then I sometimes saw shapes at the tree line in the driving snow that might have been trees bending in the wind and might not have been. Hector stationed himself at the porch railing by 4:30, an hour earlier than his usual time, looking back at me with a patience that barely concealed urgency until I opened the porch door. He was 8 years old that winter, past the age when blue-tick coonhounds are generally considered vigorous, and his back legs had developed a fine morning tremble that I noticed when I helped him down the porch steps in the cold. But those evening hours at the railing were the most alive I saw him. The visit seemed to do something for him that I could not replicate with food or warmth or company. I have thought about this often. I have a theory, which I offer as a theory and nothing more, that animals understand their own mortality in a way that is different from how humans understand theirs. More immediate, more embodied, more plainly felt. Hector was an old dog, and he knew he was an old dog, and in those evening hours at the railing he was in the presence of something whose vitality was absolute, something at the far end of the physical spectrum from where he was, and perhaps that proximity to such enormous aliveness had its own sustaining effect. I am speculating, but I watched him at that railing every evening for 3 years, and the evidence of those evenings is not speculative. Wren was bolder than Goliath in a different way and through a different register. Where Goliath's dominance was physical and immediate, Wren's was communicative. She was the architect of the birch bark exchange, which I confirmed in the 2nd winter when I woke early one morning and watched through the cabin window as she crossed the 60 yards of meadow in the gray pre-dawn light, moving in that swift, low way that made her seem to flow rather than stride, and placed a piece of bark on the bottom step with careful deliberation, and then flowed back to the tree line and disappeared before I could have reached the door. I stood at the window for a long time after that. I thought about what I was watching and what it meant. A creature roughly the size of a large automobile, built for the specific environment of deep wilderness, crossing open ground in the lightning morning to leave a piece of bark on the step of a human dwelling. The purposefulness of it, the risk of it, the long patience of the whole arrangement, the weeks and months of repetition that had preceded this specific morning, the understanding on her part that this exchange had to be built slowly, that it could not be rushed without collapsing under the weight of what it was asking the two of us to accept. She was right about that. I know she was right, because I know that if she had appeared at 30 yards in that first September, without the months of preparation that the birch bark represented, I would have gone for my rifle. I am not proud of that. It is simply the truth of what a man does when something that large and that unknown comes to the edge of his meadow. The bark changed the calculation. The bark said, "I know you are here, and I am here, and we are going to do this slowly until it becomes something neither of us is afraid of." That is a sophisticated thing to communicate. It is as sophisticated as most of the communication I have witnessed between humans. I started expanding the exchange in the second year. After the birch bark, I left a smooth river stone from the creek, round and gray, about the size of a hen's egg, placed on the step with the same care she used. It was gone the next morning. Then a single blue jay feather I found in the meadow grass, the kind of brilliant blue that still surprises you even when you've lived in those mountains for years. Gone the next morning. A piece of dried cedar from the kindling pile, fragrant, even dry, its smell carrying on a warm afternoon. Gone. She reciprocated with things that I have spent 5 years trying to understand and have largely stopped trying, because understanding is not always the right relationship to have with something. She left a hawk skull once, a red-tailed hawk from the dimensions, cleaned completely of tissue, every bone intact and undamaged, and the whole thing placed on the step with the beak aimed toward the tree line, as if pointing home. She left a piece of black stone I did not recognize until I drove it to the geology department at the University Extension in Pendleton, and a graduate student identified it as obsidian, volcanic glass, which does not occur naturally in that part of the Cascades. She left a length of rawhide twisted into a braid, the kind of braid that requires fingers and intention and time. I kept everything in a wooden box on the shelf above the stove, and the box is there right now with the lid closed, and the obsidian is on top because I take it out sometimes and hold it in my bad left hand and turn it in the light and think about the distance between where it was formed and where it ended up, and all the hands that must have touched it in between. Goliath came closer as the second year progressed. The 60 yards became 50 over the autumn months, became 40 by winter, became 30 by the following spring. 30 yards is close. At 30 yards, in the lantern light from the porch railing, I could see the specific expression of his amber eyes, the particular way his ears moved when Hector made a sound, the individual guard, hairs on his shoulders that rose slightly in a cold wind. At 30 yards, he was no longer a shape at the edge of visibility. He was a presence, specific and particular, with characteristics I could observe and catalog. He favored his left side slightly, a weight shift that suggested an old injury, or a joint problem that had healed incompletely. He watched the cabin windows when I moved inside, tracking my position the way an experienced hunter tracks movement. Not aggressively, but informationally, maintaining a map of where I was at all times. On evenings when the temperature dropped sharply, he would tuck his chin toward his chest, and his shoulders would round forward slightly, a concession to cold that was entirely recognizable, entirely animal, entirely comprehensible in the way that a shiver or a squint is comprehensible. Those moments of recognizable animal behavior were, paradoxically, the ones that affected me most. Not his enormity or his impossible anatomy, but the tucked chin in the cold. The thing that said, underneath everything else, I am a creature in weather, same as you. The spring of the second year brought the first real test of everything I had built in my thinking about what was at my tree line, which is to say it brought something I had not anticipated and could not have prepared for, which is the only kind of test worth taking seriously. A man named Greer, who worked for the county and drove a white pickup with a government seal on the door, came up the mountain road in April to check the property line markers along my north boundary, a routine survey that happened every 5 years. He arrived on a Tuesday morning when I was splitting wood at the far end of the barn, and Hector was on the porch in the thin April sunlight, and everything about the morning was ordinary. I walked Greer along the north boundary and answered his questions about the property corners, and we talked about nothing in particular: the road conditions, the late snowmelt, whether the creek had flooded in March, the kind of conversation two men have in a field when they have no particular connection, but are required to share an hour. He was pleasant. He did his work efficiently, and I respected that. But as we came back around the west side of the property toward the cabin, he stopped and looked out at the meadow and then at the tree line, and he squinted the way people squint when something is familiar, but they cannot place what it is. He said he had heard something the previous autumn when he drove past the base of my mountain road, a sound he could not identify that had stayed with him. He said it was high, and not quite animal and not quite human, and it had come from the mountain above the road at dusk, and it had made him feel, for reasons he could not articulate, that he should not stop the truck. I said I had heard elk in the autumn doing their calls, which was true, though elk were not what he was describing. He nodded as if this satisfied him, but he looked at the tree line once more before he got back in his truck, and I stood on the porch and watched him drive down the mountain road, and I thought about how thin the margin was between a life that could continue undisturbed and one that could not. One mentioned to the right person. One trail camera placed along the county road. One late evening when Greer or someone like him drove past at the wrong moment and saw a shape at the edge of the trees that no field guide could account for. I had 3 composition notebooks by then, full of dated entries and measured observations, and I had made the decision repeatedly to keep them to myself. But standing on the porch that April afternoon watching the government truck descend the mountain, I felt the full weight of what I was protecting and what I stood to lose if I failed to protect it. Not my own safety or reputation. Something much more fragile than that. The evenings at the railing, the birch bark on the step, the amber eyes at 30 yards. All of it required the mountain to stay mine and quiet and free of the attention of people who would not understand what they were seeing and would not try. Hector turned 10 in the spring of the 3rd year. I celebrated this with a piece of venison that I had been saving in the freezer since the previous November, cooked plain and served warm, which he accepted with the solemn appreciation of an animal who has learned not to expect special treatment and is therefore genuinely moved when it arrives. I took him to the veterinarian in town that spring for the first time in 2 years, loading him carefully into the truck and driving the 45 minutes down the mountain with the windows cracked so he could read the air in the last way. He still seemed to have full enthusiasm for. The veterinarian was a young woman who had been practicing there for 3 years, and who knew Hector from his previous visits, and who knelt beside him on the examination table floor in a way that told me she understood how to be with dogs. She listened to his heart with the careful expression of someone hearing something they are going to have to translate into words, and then she told me plainly what she had heard. The murmur that had been a soft irregularity 2 years before was now significant. His kidneys were declining, evident in his blood work, a gradual reduction in function that would continue in one direction. His arthritis had moved from his hips into his spine. She did not say he was dying. She said the words comfortable and quality of life and remaining time with the measured kindness of a person who has had this conversation many times and not become numb to it. I drove home with Hector in the passenger seat with his nose out the window, and I did not look at him for most of the drive because looking at him required a reckoning I was not ready for on a public road. I gave him the rest of the venison when we got home. Wren came to the porch steps in daylight once, only once. It was a July morning in the second year, about 7 in the morning, when I was inside making coffee, and Hector was already on the porch for his morning survey of the meadow. I heard him make the low sound, the vibration, frequency sound, and it was different from the evening version, more urgent, and I moved to the window without thinking and looked out. She was at the bottom of the porch steps, not 30 yards away, not at the tree line. At the bottom of my porch steps, crouched lower than she usually stood, her posture compressed in a way that I read as deliberate self-reduction, as if she was trying to take up less space in a space she knew was not hers. Hector was at the top of the steps looking down at her, his tail moving in the low arc, and she was looking up at him. They were perhaps 6 feet apart. In 7 months of watching from the porch chair, I had never seen them that close. I stood at the window and did not move. She had a piece of birch bark in her left hand, held in those long-fingered hands with a care that was unmistakable, and she set it on the bottom step with the same deliberateness she used every time, and then looked up at Hector for a moment longer, and then moved back. Not turned and fled, but moved backward, keeping her eyes on the porch, retreating in a way that was controlled and intentional, until she reached the meadow grass and then turned and crossed to the tree line with the swift, fluid movement that still, after months of watching, seemed to bypass the ordinary physics of a large body moving through space. I stood at the window with my coffee cup cooling in my hand and understood that I had just been shown something. She had not come to the steps because of necessity or accident. She had come because she wanted Hector to see her clearly, in full light, without the ambiguity of evening distance. She had come to be known by him in a different and more complete way than the evening visits allowed. Goliath produced sound 3 times in 3 years that I can account for in my notebooks. 3 times, not more. The first was in November of the second year, a cold November night when the meadow was covered in 6 inches of new snow, and the moon was full enough to make the whole field luminous and blue-white, and I had kept the lantern lit past 9 o'clock because neither of them had moved from their positions and I did not want to be the first to leave. It was close to 9:30 when Goliath made the sound. It was not a howl, though it used some of the same physical range. It was not a growl, though it had a depth that resonated in the chest from 60 yards. It was something in between and outside of both, a complex vocalization that rose and fell in a pattern that did not repeat, that contained within it what I can only describe as pitch variation with intentional structure, the way a sentence has structure, the way something meant to carry meaning is organized differently from something that simply carries sound. It lasted approximately 8 seconds. When it ended, Hector pressed himself against the railing and made his low vibration sound in response, and the 2 sounds together in that moonlit meadow were something I have no adequate language for and have stopped trying to find any. The second and third times Goliath made sound were briefer, both in the third year, both on evenings when Hector was visibly struggling to maintain his position at the railing, and both times the sound came at the moment when Hector seemed to be at the edge of his endurance, as if it were being offered at the exact point where it would do the most good. The changes began in October of the third year. Goliath started arriving earlier than his established hour, sometimes appearing at the tree line in the mid-afternoon when there was still full daylight and the meadow was completely visible. This made me uncomfortable in a way I had not felt in 2 years, a practical discomfort rooted in the fact that my property was occasionally visited by the meter reader and once a season by the county road assessor. I told myself it was the season change, the earlier dark of October pulling his schedule forward, and this explanation was adequate enough for 2 weeks. Then Ren stopped leaving bark on the step. Completely stopped. After more than 2 years of near daily placement, the step was empty morning after morning, and the absence of the bark had the specific quality of a message delivered in the negative, a communication made through withholding rather than giving. Something had changed. Something in their world, or in Hector's world, had registered a change that I was still in the process of understanding, and they were responding to it in the only language available to them. Hector was failing, and I was watching it happen and refusing to name it in the blunt way the facts required. His appetite had dropped off through October and November, not the sudden refusal that signals acute illness, but the gradual withdrawal of interest. Smaller portions left in the bowl, longer pauses before he approached it, a new tendency to sniff and then turn away that I accommodated by trying different preparations and different temperatures and different combinations until I understood that the problem was not the food, but the appetite, and the appetite was not going to improve through culinary effort. He still made it to the porch every evening, still made it to the railing, but he needed more help than before, and the journey from the corner near the stove to the porch door and down the steps and across to the railing had become a kind of daily negotiation between his will and his body's declining capacity, and his will was winning that negotiation for now, but it was costing him something irreplaceable each time. On the evenings when Goliath came to 30 yards and Hector pressed himself against the railing and made that low sound, that vibration that landed in the chest rather than the ears, Goliath would hold completely still and look at the old dog with an attention so concentrated it felt almost visible, something you could almost touch. And those evenings had the quality of a conversation I was not fluent enough to understand, but was being allowed to overhear. I started sleeping differently in December. Not badly, not with nightmares or anxiety in any form I recognized, just lighter. Waking at 2 or 3 in the morning to a quality of quiet that was different from ordinary mountain quiet, a stillness that felt attended rather than empty. I got up twice and looked through the window at the meadow and saw nothing in the dark, but the snow around the bottom porch steps both mornings held impressions that were not mine and not Hector's. Something had stood at the bottom of those steps in the night hours, and had not come up, and had not made itself known to me, and had gone back to wherever it came from before first light. I thought about what this meant for several days without arriving at a conclusion I was comfortable with. Something was keeping watch at my door in the night. Something was monitoring something I could not monitor myself, with senses I did not have, with an understanding of what was happening in that cabin that perhaps exceeded my own. The 14th of December was a Wednesday, and it was clear and cold, the kind of December cold that is not dramatic or violent, but is simply absolute, the temperature dropping from about 20 degrees at midday down toward 0 by evening. I brought Hector inside before his usual hour because of the cold, which he accepted without resistance, and this acceptance was itself a measure of something because for 3 years he had resisted coming in before the visitors at the tree line had retreated. He did not look back at the tree line when I called him. He came inside with the careful, slow movement of a dog who has learned to conserve everything, and he went to his corner and lay down, and I banked the stove and sat in the chair across from him for a while, watching him sleep. There was nothing dramatic about that evening. He ate a small amount. He breathed in the measured way of a sleeping dog. I went to bed at 9, which was earlier than my usual hour, pulled by a tiredness that felt more like heaviness than exhaustion. I woke at 2:47 in the morning. I know it was 2:47 because I looked at the clock immediately. The reflex of a man who spent 22 years being trained to orient to time as the first act of consciousness. The cabin was cold despite the banked stove, the mountain cold pressing through the walls in a way it does in the deep hours of December. I lay still for a moment and listened. I heard Hector breathing. The sound was wrong. It was not the easy respiratory rhythm of a sleeping dog, but something slower and wetter, labored in a way that required effort, with pauses between each exhale that stretched long enough to make me hold my own breath in the dark, waiting for the next one to come. I was across the cabin floor and on my knees beside him before I was fully awake, my hand on his rib cage, feeling the shallow rise and fall, the difficult mechanics of a body working very hard to do something that had always required no effort at all. His eyes were open and calm, looking at the orange glow of the stove damper, and his tail moved once when my hand touched him. Once, a single slow sweep across the floor, and then it came to rest, and the breathing came to rest, and the whole enormous quantity of him, the years and the miles and the 10,000 evenings on the porch railing, and the weight of all that patient, deliberate living went still. I will not describe what the next hour was like except to say that I sat with my hand on his side until the warmth left him, and first light came gray at the eastern window. Then I got up and put on every layer I owned, and took the spade from the barn and the lantern from the porch railing, and walked out into the meadow in the dark toward the old fir tree at the tree line, the one he had always faced when he looked from the railing, because I needed to bury him there, and I needed to do it before the ground froze any harder. I carried the lantern and the spade, and I was not thinking about anything except the mechanics of the next hour, because that is how grief operates on a practical man in a practical crisis. I walked 60 yards through the dark. I raised the lantern, and I saw the hole. 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide, the walls clean and even, the displaced earth piled to the right with the neatness of someone who had been careful and deliberate, and the tracks in the snow around it pressed deep and specific. The long-toed, wide-heeled tracks I had been recognizing for 3 years. I stood at that hole for a long time, long enough to grow very cold, long enough for the full weight of what I was looking at to move through me in the way that true things move, slowly, completely, without urgency because they are not going anywhere. Something had come to my land in the night, in the hours when I sat inside with my hand on a dying dog, and it had dug a grave with its hands in frozen ground, and it had placed the turned earth carefully to one side, and it had gone back to the trees. It had known before I knew. It had come before I needed it to come, so that what needed to be done would already be done when the time came. I do not know how to explain what that meant to me, standing in the dark with a spade in my hand and a dead dog wrapped in burlap at the cabin door waiting. I will not try to explain it fully because I do not have the words for the full measure of it. What I can say is that I stood at that hole and understood that I had been living for 3 years inside a form of care that I had never thought to look for, never imagined existed, and would never have found if a tired old dog had not sat down at the edge of a porch railing one September evening and kept a faith with something in the dark that I was too limited to recognize on my own. I went back to the cabin and wrapped Hector in the burlap and carried him out to the fir tree in my arms and laid him in the hole that had been prepared for him. The earth went back over him in layers, the frozen chunks first, and then the finer soil, and I packed it down the way you pack down things you want to hold in place. Then I went to the creek and stripped a piece of birch bark from the cluster there, the same cluster Wren had been visiting for 3 years, and I placed it on the mound, bark side up, centered, the way it had always been done between us. I stood for a while in the cold and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the act itself had not already said. Then I walked back to the cabin with the empty spade and the lantern, and I did not look back at the tree line, and I have not seen Goliath or Wren since that night. They stopped coming. I expected them back the next evening, and they did not come. I kept the lantern burning on the porch railing past 8 o'clock for the first week, standing outside in the cold in the posture of waiting that I had occupied every evening for 3 years, and the tree line was just a tree line, dark and ordinary and full of nothing that looked back at me. I left birch bark on the step every morning for 6 weeks. It was never taken. I walked out to the grave at the fir tree on the evenings when I could bring myself to, and I stood at the mound and looked back at the cabin, and the distance between the two was exactly 60 yards. The same 60 yards that had held 3 years of impossible evenings, and it felt now like an ordinary field, which is somehow the emptiest thing a field can feel like. In the 4th autumn, after the visits ended, I found a piece of birch bark on the bottom step. I was coming back from the barn at dusk with an armload of firewood, and I nearly stepped on it. It was placed the way they had always been placed, centered, bark side up, and it was fresh, stripped recently from a living tree, the inner surface still pale and slightly damp. I set the wood down and picked it up and held it in my bad left hand, and stood on the step for a long time in the failing light, looking at the tree line, which was just a tree line, ordinary and dark and full of ordinary dark things. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound except the creak under its first thin ice and the wind in the upper branches of the firs. I went inside and placed the bark on top of the wooden box on the shelf, on top of the obsidian, and I did not try to explain it, and I did not write about it in any of my notebooks. Some things I have decided to keep without examining them. This is one of those things. The bark is still there. I am 65 now. My left hand is stiffer in cold weather than it was, and my right ear has gotten worse, and the south roof section needs replacing again, and I have not gotten another dog. The composition notebooks are on the shelf. The wooden box is beside them with the obsidian on top, and the hawk skull underneath and the braided rawhide coiled around everything else. I take the obsidian out sometimes in the evenings and hold it in my bad left hand and stand at the porch door looking at the tree line, not waiting for anything, just looking. Because looking at that tree line is the clearest way I have found to be close to those 3 years and everything they held. The grave at the fir tree is greening in spring and snow-covered in winter, and unremarkable to anyone who does not know what it is. I walk out to it still. Not every evening, not with any ceremony, but sometimes when the light is going and the cold is coming in from the north and the meadow has that particular late afternoon quality that it had on the best of those 3 years, I walk out across the 60 yards and stand at the mound and put my hand on the bark of the old fir tree above it, and I look back at the porch and the lit window and the empty railing, and I think about what it means that something came out of the wild to dig that hole. Not the how of it or the why of it in any explainable sense, not the nature of the creature or the question of its existence, just the fact of the act itself, the choice to come out of the dark and do the thing that needed to be done for something it had spent 3 years watching over, the willingness to be exposed, to cross 60 yards of open meadow and work in the frost, locked ground with its hands, and leave the evidence of itself in the snow for a man with a rifle to find in the morning. That willingness tells me something that I did not know before and cannot unknow. It tells me that whatever comes out of the wilderness, whatever we have decided should not exist, whatever lives in the parts of the world we have stopped believing in, has its own understanding of what it means to sit with something through its final hours, its own understanding of what a grave means and why one matters. That is not comfort exactly. It is something more durable than comfort. It is the knowledge that care in its most complete form requires nothing from the one being cared for. Not recognition, not reciprocation, not even awareness. Goliath and Wren came every evening for 3 years to an old dog on a porch railing, and the old dog gave them nothing that could be weighed or measured or named, and they came anyway. And when the time came, they dug the ground open with their hands so that nothing about his leaving would go unattended. I think that is what love looks like when it has no reason to perform itself for anyone. I think that might be the only kind worth learning from. The script is completed now. I want to go back and tell you one more thing about the third summer, because it is the thing I have left out until now, and I left it out deliberately, saving it for the end the way you save a thing you are not yet sure you have the right words for. It was late August, a warm and clear evening, the kind of August evening in the Cascades where the sky goes through a long and indecisive sunset, and the air holds the heat of the day well into the dark, and Hector was at the railing with a stillness in him that was different from his usual watchful stillness. He had been having a harder week, more help on the steps, less interest in food, the tremor in his legs more visible in the evening than the morning. Goliath was at 30 yards. Wren was slightly behind him, closer to the tree line than usual, and the three of them, the old dog at the railing and the two enormous shapes in the meadow grass, were perfectly still in the last amber light. I sat in my chair and watched, and after perhaps 20 minutes of that stillness, Goliath did something I had never seen him do. He lowered himself, not fully to the ground, not a crouch or a drop, but a partial lowering of that enormous body, his knees bending, his spine tilting forward, his head coming down from its usual height until he was maybe 5.5 feet at the shoulder instead of 8. And in that lowered posture he was looking directly at Hector from 30 yards across the meadow, eye level or close to it, the amber eyes and the brown eyes at approximately the same height above the ground. They looked at each other across those 30 yards for a long time. Hector's tail moved in the low arc, the one that meant recognition and something beyond recognition. Goliath stayed in that lowered position for perhaps 3 minutes, which is a long time for a large animal to hold an uncomfortable posture, and then he rose back to his full height and stepped back to the tree line and was gone. Wren followed. Hector held his position at the railing for another few minutes, and then came slowly to me, and put his graying head on my knee and stood there, and I put my hand on him, and felt the warmth of him and the particular weight of a dog who has had a significant day and knows it, and we sat like that until the last of the light was gone and the meadow was dark and the stars were coming up clear and cold above the firs. I did not write that evening in my notebook. I wrote everything else down, 3 years of it, because I understood from the beginning that I was a witness to something that deserved precision, that the act of writing it accurately was a form of respect for what I was being allowed to see. But I did not write that evening down because writing it down felt like the wrong relationship to have with it. Some things should be kept exactly as they were, not translated. The lowered posture, the direct look across 30 yards, the old dog's head on my knee in the dark. Those 3 things together constitute the clearest statement I received in 3 years about what was happening in that meadow, and the statement did not require my words and does not require them now. What I have arrived at in 5 years of thinking about this is something much smaller than an answer and much more durable than certainty. Hector was 11 years old when he died, and he had been a working dog past his working years, and an old dog past his prime years, and by any reasonable measure his last 3 years on that mountain should have been a quiet diminishment. Instead, they were the fullest years I saw him live. Something came to the edge of the wild every evening and looked at him from 30 yards, and he pressed himself against that porch railing and made that low sound that landed in the chest rather than the ears, and he was present in those moments in a way that had nothing to do with age or infirmity, or the long list of things his body was losing. What I could not give him, not with all my care and all my consistency and all the warmth of that corner near the stove, whatever that was, came to him from the tree line every evening in the amber-eyed dark. And then, when his time came, the thing that had loved him in its own impossible language made sure he did not go into the ground uncared for.